Why did Hitler think he could take Moscow so easily?
Because he thought speed would solve everything. Hitler had become addicted to momentum. Blitzkrieg, his lightning war strategy, had crushed Poland, France, and much of Western Europe. Cities had fallen in weeks, sometimes days. So when he turned east in June 1941 with Operation Barbarossa, he didn't see the Soviet Union as a giant. He saw it as a collapsing monster. He thought he could kick it and it would fall. But Russia isn't just land. It's endurance, it's weather, it's stubbornness written into geography. The Germans attacked with over 3 million soldiers, the largest invasion force in history. And at first, it worked. Soviet forces were caught completely off guard. Whole divisions were encircled and destroyed. The Luftwaffe dominated the skies. And by October, the Germans were within 100 kilometers of Moscow. Stalin's government was evacuating archives, factories, and families. Panic set in.
Was Stalin scared?
More than scared. He disappeared from public view for several days in late October. Some of his officials thought he might flee, but he didn't. And when he reappeared, he made a decision that would change the war. He would defend Moscow at all costs. And that decision was not just political. It was symbolic. If Moscow fell, the heart of Soviet resistance would collapse. Hitler knew this. That's why he ordered Operation Typhoon, a massive push to seize the capital before winter fully arrived. And for a moment, it looked like it might work.
They got that close?
Very close. German troops could see the spires of Moscow through their field glasses. The city's outer defenses were under attack. Soviet forces were exhausted, short on ammunition, and reeling. But then came October rains, followed by snow. The roads turned to mud. Tanks sank. Trucks stalled. Horses collapsed. And then, in November, the mud froze, and the cold truly began. The Wehrmacht wasn't ready. Their uniforms were meant for autumn, not Russian winter. Soldiers wrapped themselves in rags, stole civilian coats, or died in their sleep from exposure. Grease and weapons froze solid. Fuel turned to slush. Mechanized war stopped moving. And just as the Germans were freezing in place, a new figure arrived in Moscow.
Zhukov?
Yes, Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov. He had already earned Stalin's respect by saving Leningrad from collapse. Now he was entrusted with the defense of the capital. He didn't hesitate. He assessed the front, restructured command, pulled in Siberian divisions, fresh, battle-hardened troops trained in snow combat, brought over only after Soviet spies confirmed Japan wouldn't invade from the east. Zhukov ordered layers of defense, trenches, anti-tank ditches, barbed wire, artillery nests, circling the city. Every able-bodied citizen was digging, building, or preparing to resist. Children carried ammunition, women sewed uniforms, old men patrolled neighborhoods.
So it became a war for the city.
It became a war for the soul of a nation. On November 7th, with the city still under siege, Stalin held a military parade in Red Square. Tanks rolled past Lenin's mausoleum. Soldiers saluted their leader and then marched straight to the front, just a few kilometers away. That parade wasn't just theater. It was a statement. Moscow would not be abandoned, and neither would the counterattack.
They attacked in the winter?
They did. On December 5th, as temperatures dropped below minus 30 degrees Celsius, Zhukov unleashed the counteroffensive. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops, supported by ski battalions and T-34 tanks, surged forward. The Germans were shocked. They believed the Soviets were spent, that winter meant the fighting would pause. But instead, they were driven back. Town after town, trench after trench, the Red Army reclaimed ground. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't precise, but it was relentless.
Was this the turning point?
Not quite, not yet, but it was the first time, the very first time, that Hitler's army had been stopped. Moscow held, and with that, the illusion of German invincibility was shattered. But Hitler didn't see it that way. To him, retreat was betrayal. He raged at his generals. He took direct control of the army. He became obsessed with punishing failure. And in the snows outside Moscow, as bodies froze in ditches and burned villages smoked on the horizon, something darker began to take root. A plan that would go beyond conquest. A plan that would target not just armies, but entire peoples.
What do you mean?
It became a war for the soul of a nation. On November 7th, with the city still under siege, Stalin held a military parade in Red Square. Tanks rolled past Lenin's mausoleum. Soldiers saluted their leader and then marched straight to the front, just a few kilometers away. That parade wasn't just theater. It was a statement. Moscow would not be abandoned, and neither would the counterattack.
You said what came next wasn't war. What did you mean?
What began after Moscow wasn't just about battles anymore. It became a war of survival, of annihilation. For Hitler, Moscow's failure wasn't just a setback. It was personal. His myth of invincibility had cracked, and when that illusion broke, his cruelty grew sharper. He blamed his generals. He forbade retreat. He took direct control of the army's decisions. The Wehrmacht, once a professional force, started turning into a machine for destruction, not just of soldiers, but of civilians, villages, cultures.
So the retreat wasn't clean?
Nothing was clean. The Germans weren't just pushed back, they were hunted. Soviet forces chased them through forests and towns they had once occupied. The roads were clogged with broken tanks, frozen horses, wounded men limping westward. And as the Soviets advanced, they found what the occupiers had left behind: burned villages, mass graves, looted homes. The snow couldn't cover it all, and it fueled something deep in the Red Army, not just vengeance, but a fire to keep going. Zhukov didn't stop. He pushed them back 100 miles. That might not seem like much, but in Russian winter, through frozen rivers and waist-deep snow, it was staggering. But let's pause here for a moment.
Why?
Because we need to remember what was at stake. The Battle of Moscow wasn't just about geography. It was psychological. For the Soviets, it proved they could survive. For the Germans, it planted the first seed of doubt. Before Moscow, the Nazis looked unstoppable. After Moscow, their timeline collapsed. Hitler had promised a quick victory. Instead, he was now staring into a two-front war, stretched supply lines, and a furious Soviet Union that had tasted its first real triumph. And that's not all.
What else?
Remember that date, December 5th, 1941, when the Soviet counteroffensive began. Just 2 days later, on December 7th, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. The United States entered the war. Hitler had hoped to crush the Soviets before the Americans could intervene. Now, that hope was gone. His enemies were growing, and Moscow had held.
So this was the beginning of the end?
Not yet, but it was the first fracture. The war would go on for nearly 4 more years. There would be Stalingrad, Kursk, the siege of Leningrad, D-Day, but everything began to shift here. in the snow outside Moscow. And for the Soviet Union, this was more than a military moment. It became a legend, the capital that never fell, the people who never gave up, the city that froze the Nazi war machine in its tracks.
Was it worth the cost?
Over 1 million people were killed, wounded, or went missing in the Battle of Moscow. Both sides suffered terribly. Entire villages were erased, families shattered, fields turned to graves. So was it worth it? History doesn't answer in emotions. But if Moscow had fallen, the world might look very different today.
And what about the soldiers who marched in that Red Square parade?
Many didn't come back. They knew that. They marched anyway.
I won't forget them.
Good. That's why we tell these stories. Not to glorify, not to dramatize, but to remember.